In our last video, we talked about tax incidents and how it didn't matter who was taxed in a market. The buyer or the seller both share that tax. So that raises the question then, is that sharing always equal or is it unequal? And if so, if it's unequal, why? What leads to one of these agents, either the buyer or the seller, why do they end up paying a higher burden of the tax? So let's motivate this with a graph. Now, we know that along a demand curve, right, along that demand curve, that elasticity changes. And we start at very, very, very elastic, and then we get to very inelastic. But we can look at a single curve and tell whether it's fairly elastic or inelastic. Now, this demand curve here is pretty inelastic, especially compared to the supply curve. This supply curve is relatively elastic. You can tell that because, change in price, right, a little small change in price leads to a pretty big change in the quantity supplied there. So let's take those out. We don't really want those there right now. So a small change in price leads to a big change in the quantity supplied. So we can say that that supply curve is pretty elastic. Okay? So that means that the buyers are not going to be very responsive to a change in price, but the sellers will be. So that actually gives us a clue about who pays a tax burden, who pays the higher tax burden. If you are being charged on every unit of consumption you buy a tax, so let's say every time I buy a gallon of gas, I'm paying $1 per gallon in tax. If I don't respond very much to price changes, what if they raise that price to $2? Am I going to buy any less gas? No, because I have a pretty inelastic demand. But on the other hand, somebody who's really responsive, you raise their taxes, they just opt out of that market because they're really responsive to price changes. If they don't buy it, they don't pay the tax. So whoever, whether that's the supplier or demander, whichever of these two agents has a more inelastic curve, pays the higher burden of a tax. So in other words, the incidence of a tax falls more heavily on whichever party in the market is the most inelastic. So let's demonstrate that here. Let's put a tax on our sellers. So ST. And we'll use our same method as before, figuring out before and after welfare. So here's our price before, our quantity before, and after. Let's do the red for the after. That is the quantity after the tax. That's the price paid. That is the after-tax amount that the sellers actually get. So that rectangle there represents tax revenue. And look at the size of these two boxes within tax revenue. The top one is always what is paid by the buyers. The bottom one is paid by the sellers. The sellers have a tiny little tax revenue burden, but the buyers, right, the size of their rectangle is much bigger. So that's how we can use this graph to demonstrate what common sense tells us. If you can't respond to a price change, then if somebody taxes you, that's a price change. You're not going to respond. You're going to keep buying the good anyway and just end up paying the tax.